Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is Medieval Anxiety Treatments, the Horrifying Truth. You get comfortable, take a moment, like the video, and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Medieval Anxiety Treatments, the Horrifying Truth. For most people today, anxiety is something we recognize as a mental health condition. We understand that it can affect anyone regardless of age, wealth, or background. Doctors describe it as a complex interaction between the brain, the body, genetics, environment, and personal experiences. Therapy, medication, and lifestyle changes have become common ways of managing it. While anxiety is still challenging, modern society generally accepts that it is a real medical condition deserving compassion and treatment. But travel back nearly 1,000 years into medieval Europe and everything changes. Imagine waking in the middle of the night with your heart racing so violently that it feels as though it might burst from your chest. Your breathing becomes rapid. Your hands tremble uncontrollably. Every shadow in your room appears alive. Every strange sound outside your wooden home convinces you that something terrible is coming. Today, someone might call this a panic attack. In the Middle Ages, people rarely had those words. Instead, they often believed something much darker was happening. Perhaps God was punishing you. Perhaps Satan had entered your soul. Perhaps a demon had attached itself to your body. Perhaps your own sinful thoughts had invited evil spirits into your life. Or perhaps your body had become dangerously unbalanced, allowing black bile to poison your mind. For medieval people, anxiety was not simply an uncomfortable feeling. It could become evidence of spiritual failure, supernatural attack, or physical corruption. Every explanation carried terrifying consequences because each explanation demanded its own frightening treatment. Understanding why medieval anxiety treatments became so horrifying requires stepping inside a completely different world, a world where religion shaped every aspect of daily life, where disease appeared without warning, where wars destroyed villages overnight, where famine and plague could erase entire families, and where almost nobody understood how the human brain actually worked. Fear was everywhere. Children watched siblings die before reaching adulthood. Women risked death during childbirth. Farmers depended entirely on weather they could not control. Kings launched wars that uprooted thousands of ordinary lives. Bandits waited along lonely roads. Wild animals roamed forests. Disease spread without explanation. Death rarely arrived peacefully. In such a world, constant worry almost became normal. Yet medieval people did not separate emotional suffering from physical suffering as clearly as we do today. Mind, body, and soul were believed to exist together, constantly influencing one another. If one became damaged, the others would eventually suffer as well. This belief created treatments that seem shocking today. Some patients were encouraged to bleed. Others swallowed mysterious mixtures containing herbs, minerals, wine, animal parts, or ingredients whose effects nobody truly understood. Some spent days praying without food. Others endured painful rituals intended to drive demons from their bodies. Many were told their fear resulted from personal sin. Some never recovered from hearing those words. To understand how these ideas developed, we must first understand medieval medicine itself. Unlike modern doctors, medieval physicians inherited much of their knowledge from ancient Greek and Roman scholars. One of the most influential ideas came from the theory of the four humors. According to this system, every human body contained four essential fluids: blood, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm. Health depended upon these four remaining perfectly balanced. When balance disappeared, disease appeared. Someone who seemed cheerful and energetic supposedly possessed abundant healthy blood. Someone quick to anger contained excessive yellow bile. Someone slow, withdrawn, fearful, or deeply sad supposedly suffered from too much black bile. Someone calm or sluggish might have excessive phlegm. This theory remained remarkably influential for centuries. It affected treatments for headaches, fever, infections, depression, anxiety, and countless other conditions. Because anxiety often involves fear, sleeplessness, trembling, sadness, and obsessive thinking. Physicians frequently blamed black bile. This condition became associated with melancholy. Today, melancholy usually describes sadness. During the Middle Ages, however, melancholy represented something far broader. It included symptoms we might now identify as depression, chronic anxiety, panic attacks, obsessive thoughts, emotional exhaustion, and even certain psychotic illnesses. One diagnosis covered many completely different disorders because physicians lacked the scientific tools to distinguish them. If someone constantly worried about death, if they feared invisible dangers, if they could not sleep, if they cried without explanation, if they withdrew from society, if they believed disaster waited around every corner, melancholy became a likely diagnosis. Once physicians believed black bile caused the illness, treatment naturally focused upon removing or balancing that humor. Sometimes patients received special diets. Sometimes they exercised. Sometimes they rested. Sometimes they drank herbal mixtures. And sometimes they lost blood. Bloodletting became one of medieval medicine's most famous and infamous procedures. Doctors believed removing blood could restore internal balance. The practice appeared logical according to their understanding of the body. Unfortunately, the human body does not work that way. Many already frightened, exhausted patients became even weaker after losing significant amounts of blood. Yet physicians often interpreted worsening symptoms as evidence that additional treatment remained necessary. The cycle could continue repeatedly. But medicine represented only one side of medieval thinking. Religion often proved even more influential. Christian Europe believed the invisible world constantly interacted with the visible one. Angels watched humanity, saints interceded, demons tempted. The devil searched endlessly for vulnerable souls. Fear itself sometimes appeared spiritually dangerous. excessive worry suggested a failure to trust God's plan. If someone constantly feared tomorrow, perhaps their faith had weakened. Priests therefore approached anxiety differently from physicians. Rather than examining bodily humors, they examined conscience. Had the sufferer confessed every sin? Had they attended church faithfully? Had they prayed sincerely? Had they become prideful? Had they secretly doubted God's mercy? These questions could provide comfort for some believers. For others, they increased guilt. Imagine experiencing overwhelming anxiety while being told that your fear itself might offend God. Instead of reducing distress, this belief sometimes deepened it. Every frightening thought became another reason to worry. Every sleepless night suggested spiritual weakness. Every panic attack seemed like evidence of moral failure. Yet it would be unfair to portray every medieval priest as cruel. Many genuinely cared for suffering people. Monasteries frequently offered shelter. Monks copied medical texts. Some religious communities preserved ancient medical knowledge that otherwise might have disappeared forever. Prayer itself also provided emotional comfort. Modern psychology recognizes that meditation, structured routines, supportive communities, and hopeful beliefs can reduce stress for many individuals. In some unexpected ways, certain medieval religious practices probably did help anxious people feel calmer. The problem arose when every unexplained mental struggle automatically became spiritual warfare. If anxiety refused to disappear despite prayer, suspicion often shifted toward darker possibilities. Could demons be involved? This question terrified medieval society. Throughout Europe, stories circulated describing evil spirits entering vulnerable people. Victims supposedly screamed, shook violently, spoke strangely, or behaved irrationally. Some symptoms resembled neurological disorders. Others reflected severe psychiatric illnesses. Still others may have been epilepsy. Without scientific knowledge, observers interpreted everything through religious belief. An anxious individual suffering panic attacks might suddenly appear possessed. Rapid breathing, uncontrolled trembling, intense fear, emotional outbursts, collapse. To modern observers, these symptoms fit several medical explanations. To medieval witnesses, supernatural explanations often seemed more convincing. This belief transformed treatment dramatically. Instead of herbs, instead of rest, instead of emotional support, patients might undergo exorcisms. These ceremonies ranged from gentle prayers to deeply frightening rituals. Some involved holy water, some involved relics, some required prolonged fasting, some demanded repeated confessions. The goal remained the same: drive evil away. Whether evil truly existed mattered less than what people sincerely believed. Belief itself shaped treatment. Belief shaped fear. Belief shaped hope. Belief shaped survival. Ordinary villagers rarely questioned these explanations because no better scientific alternatives existed. Knowledge spread slowly. Books remained expensive. Universities educated only a tiny minority. Most families depended upon local priests, healers, herbalists, and experienced elders. Each community developed its own traditions. Some remedies came from Roman medicine, others descended from pagan customs. Many blended Christianity with older folklore. An anxious child might receive prayers from a priest in the morning, herbal tea from a grandmother by afternoon, and protective charms before bedtime. Nobody saw contradiction. Every possible source of protection seemed worth trying. Life itself felt uncertain enough. By the 13th century, universities across Europe slowly expanded medical education. Students studied ancient authorities, including Hippocrates and Galen. They learned anatomy mostly through books rather than human dissection. They memorized humoral theory. They practiced astrology alongside medicine because many believed stars influenced health. The position of planets sometimes determined when treatments should begin. Even bloodletting could depend upon astrology. Today, this sounds unbelievable. Then it represented respected scholarship. The physician sincerely believed he followed the best medical knowledge available. The priest sincerely believed he protected souls. The herbalist sincerely believed plants carried healing power. Each worked within the limits of medieval understanding. Unfortunately, anxiety rarely obeyed those limits. It returned again and again. Each relapse convinced many sufferers that something even more terrible hid beneath the surface. As fear grew, treatments often became harsher. Some people would endure painful procedures. Others would spend weeks in isolation. Some would be accused of inviting evil into their own lives. And a few would become victims of one of the darkest misunderstandings in medieval history. Because when fear could not be explained, someone always searched for a monster. Faith, fear, and the first, horrifying treatments. If you lived in medieval Europe and began suffering from what we would now recognize as severe anxiety, the first person you turned to might not have been a physician at all. In many villages, there simply wasn't one. Doctors were expensive, usually lived in larger towns or cities, and their services were often available only to nobles, wealthy merchants, monasteries, or members of the royal court. For ordinary people, the local priest was far more accessible. He baptized children, performed marriages, buried the dead, settled disputes, and listened to confessions. He was not only a religious leader, but often the most educated person for miles around. He could read Latin, owned books, and was seen as someone who understood both the natural and supernatural worlds. So when someone couldn't sleep for weeks, trembled without explanation, constantly feared death, or believed that disaster was just around the corner, families frequently sought spiritual guidance before medical treatment. This decision made perfect sense within the medieval worldview. People believed that every illness had a deeper meaning. A fever might be a test from God. A failed harvest could be divine punishment. A plague might be God's judgment on sinful humanity. If entire kingdoms believed that disasters reflected God's will, then personal suffering naturally invited the same questions. What sin caused this? What lesson is God teaching? Has Satan found a way into this person's soul? These questions weren't asked out of cruelty. Most people genuinely believed they were searching for the truth. For someone already overwhelmed by anxiety, however, those questions could become another source of fear. Imagine waking every morning with your heart pounding. You cannot explain why you're afraid. You simply know that something feels terribly wrong. Then your neighbors begin whispering. Perhaps you've offended God. Perhaps you failed to confess an important sin. Perhaps your fear is proof that your faith isn't strong enough. Suddenly your anxiety has become more than a medical problem. It has become a spiritual crisis. Confession was often the first recommendation. The church taught that sin separated people from God. Confessing those sins should restored that relationship and brought peace to the soul. For many believers, confession genuinely provided emotional relief. Speaking openly about guilt, regret, or fear could ease psychological burdens in ways surprisingly similar to modern talk therapy. But confession had limits. If anxiety continued after repeated confessions, people began looking for other explanations. Maybe hidden sins remained. Maybe someone had placed a curse on the sufferer. Maybe an evil spirit refused to leave. The more mysterious the illness became, the more frightening the explanations often grew. Prayer became another major treatment. Families gathered around anxious relatives, asking God for healing. Special prayers were recited repeatedly. Passages from Scripture were read aloud. The Lord's Prayer echoed through homes, monasteries, and churches. People sincerely believed that God's power could calm troubled minds. In some cases, structured prayer probably did help. Modern researchers know that repetitive prayer, meditation, controlled breathing, and participation in supportive communities can reduce stress for many people. But medieval prayer rarely existed alone. It was often accompanied by fasting. The logic seemed straightforward. If the soul needed cleansing, denying the body food might strengthen spiritual discipline. Many anxious individuals were encouraged to eat less, pray more, and devote themselves entirely to God. Unfortunately, prolonged fasting can have serious physical effects. Low blood sugar causes weakness. It can produce dizziness. It may increase irritability. It often makes anxious feelings even more intense. Someone already struggling with panic could become even more frightened after days of eating very little. Yet few recognize the connection. Instead, worsening symptoms sometimes convinced observers that evil forces were resisting the treatment. That belief led to stronger religious interventions. Holy water became a common source of comfort. Priests sprinkled homes. They blessed bedrooms. They blessed clothing. They blessed beds where frightened people slept. Crosses were placed near doors. Relics of saints were carried close to the body. Pilgrimages to famous shrines became another recommended remedy. People traveled for days or even weeks to visit places believed to possess miraculous healing powers. The journey itself was exhausting. Some walked barefoot as an act of devotion. Others carried heavy burdens to demonstrate repentance. Many believed that greater sacrifice increased the likelihood of divine healing. For anxious sufferers, these pilgrimages offered hope. Sometimes hope alone provided temporary relief. But not everyone improved. Those who remained fearful after exhausting every spiritual remedy entered dangerous territory. Whispers began. If prayers aren't working, if confession isn't helping, if holy water changes nothing, then perhaps something darker is involved. The word possession entered the conversation. Today, possession belongs mostly to horror films and fiction. During the Middle Ages, it represented a terrifying possibility accepted by many educated people. Demons weren't viewed as symbols. They were believed to be real beings actively interfering in human lives. Any unusual behavior attracted attention. Uncontrollable shaking, sudden screaming, intense emotional outbursts, hearing voices, extreme fear, refusing food, sleepless nights, speaking irrationally. These symptoms could all be interpreted as evidence that an evil spirit had entered the body. Many illnesses now recognized as epilepsy, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, severe depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or panic disorder were sometimes misunderstood in this way. That misunderstanding shaped treatment. Exorcisms varied greatly. Some consisted of calm prayers, asking God to remove evil. Others became dramatic public ceremonies. Priests read passages from the Bible. They commanded demons to leave in the name of Christ. Holy water was sprinkled repeatedly. Crosses touched the sufferer's forehead. Relics of saints were pressed against the body. Witnesses watched carefully for signs of change. If the person screamed or shook violently, many believed the demon was resisting. Ironically, someone experiencing a panic attack could react exactly that way. Their fear intensified. Their breathing accelerated. Their muscles tightened. Their heart raced even faster. Observers interpreted these reactions as proof that the ritual was working. The cycle reinforced itself. Sometimes exorcisms lasted hours. Others continued for days. Some were repeated over weeks or months. Not every priest approved of extreme methods. Church authorities occasionally warned against superstition and false accusations. Even so, local traditions often shaped practice more than official teaching. Every village developed its own beliefs. Every region preserved unique customs. Some mixed Christian rituals with much older folk traditions that had survived from pre-Christian Europe. Protective charms were common. People wore small crosses. Others carried written prayers folded into tiny packets. Certain herbs were hung above doors. Animals' bones, carved symbols, or blessed objects were believed to keep evil away. From today's perspective, these practices may appear irrational, yet they offered something every anxious person desperately seeks: a feeling of control. When life feels unpredictable, rituals provide structure. They make people feel they are doing something instead of simply waiting. That psychological comfort explains why similar protective rituals exist in many cultures throughout history. Still, not all spiritual treatments were gentle. Some priests believed fear itself reflected insufficient faith. They urged sufferers to trust God more completely, to stop worrying, to stop doubting, to stop fearing. For someone with clinical anxiety, this advice was nearly impossible to follow.
Imagine telling a person with a broken leg simply to walk normally. That is similar to telling someone with severe anxiety to simply stop being afraid. The sufferer often blamed themselves. If I were truly faithful, if I loved God enough, if I prayed harder, then surely this fear would disappear. Instead of finding peace, they experienced even greater guilt. Anxiety fed guilt. Guilt fed anxiety. The cycle became endless. Meanwhile, families watched helplessly. Parents feared for their children. Husbands feared for their wives. Wives feared for their husbands. Without scientific explanations, they did the only thing they knew. They sought more prayers, more blessings, more relics, more pilgrimages, more fasting, more rituals. Everything was driven by hope. Hope that tomorrow would finally bring relief. Sometimes it did. Many episodes of anxiety naturally improve over time, and when that happened, the most recent treatment received the credit. If someone recovered after visiting a shrine, the shrine was declared miraculous. If someone improved after wearing a relic, the relic gained fame. If someone felt calmer after weeks of prayer, prayer became unquestionable proof of healing. No one realized that anxiety can fluctuate on its own. No one understood brain chemistry. No one knew about neurotransmitters, trauma, or psychological disorders. They interpreted recovery through the only framework they possessed: faith. But when faith-based treatments failed completely, many sufferers were finally sent to physicians. There they would encounter another terrifying world, one built not on demons and sin, but on blood, black bile, and one of the most infamous medical practices in history. The next stage of treatment would not involve confession or prayer. It would involve knives, bowls, and the belief that draining blood could save a troubled mind. Why medieval doctors believed bleeding could cure anxiety. After weeks or even months of prayers, confessions, fasting, blessings, and visits to holy shrines, many anxious sufferers eventually found themselves standing before one of the most respected figures in medieval society, a physician. Unlike the village priest, the physician approached illness from what people believed was a scientific perspective. He had studied ancient medical texts, memorized the writings of Greek and Roman scholars, and learned the theories that had shaped European medicine for more than 1,000 years. To modernize much of that knowledge seems deeply flawed. Yet in the Middle Ages, it represented the very best medical science available. The physician did not begin by asking about childhood trauma or emotional stress. He knew nothing about brain chemistry, neurotransmitters, or anxiety disorders. Those concepts would not exist for centuries. Instead, he focused on balance. Everything in the human body, he believed, depended on maintaining perfect harmony between 4 essential bodily fluids known as the humors: blood, yellow bile, black bile, phlegm. According to ancient physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, every disease resulted from an imbalance among these 4 humors. A healthy body contained them in the correct proportions. An unhealthy body did not. This simple idea became the foundation of medieval medicine.
If someone developed a fever, the humors were out of balance. If someone suffered headaches, the humors were out of balance. If someone experienced terrifying fear, sleepless nights, constant worry, trembling, hopelessness, or emotional collapse, the answer remained exactly the same. The humors had become unbalanced. Among all four, one humor attracted particular attention when treating emotional disorders: black bile. Physicians believed excessive black bile poisoned both the body and the mind. Too much of it supposedly produced melancholy, a condition far broader than what we call sadness today. Melancholy included fear, persistent worry, hopelessness, withdrawal from society, dark thoughts, difficulty sleeping, nightmares, obsessive thinking, loss of interest in life, panic, sometimes even hallucinations. Today we recognize these symptoms as belonging to several completely different mental illnesses, but medieval physicians grouped them together. The diagnosis seemed logical according to the knowledge they possessed. Once the cause appeared obvious, the treatment also seemed obvious: restore balance. The question was how. Some physicians recommended dietary changes. Foods were believed to possess natural qualities: hot, cold, dry, moist. Every meal affected the humors. A patient overwhelmed by fear might receive carefully selected foods designed to cool excessive heat or reduce dryness, believed responsible for melancholy. Heavy red meats were sometimes avoided. Fresh fruits might be encouraged. Certain vegetables gained reputations for calming the body. Warm broths were often prescribed for weakened patients. Wine, surprisingly, appeared frequently in medical treatments. Not excessive drinking. Measured quantities. Wine was thought to aid digestion, improve circulation, and strengthen weakened bodies when consumed correctly. Different wines supposedly produced different medical effects. Some physicians even mixed herbs directly into wine to create medicinal drinks. Many herbal remedies contained ingredients still familiar today: lavender, chamomile, lemon balm, rosemary, mint, valerian, sage. Some of these plants genuinely contain compounds that can promote relaxation or improve sleep. Modern science has confirmed that certain herbs possess mild calming properties, although they are far from cures for severe anxiety. Without realizing it, medieval healers occasionally stumbled upon treatments that offered small amounts of real relief. Unfortunately, these gentler remedies often shared space with much harsher practices. The most famous was bloodletting. To medieval physicians, bloodletting was not a desperate last resort. It was one of the most respected medical procedures available. If the body contained too much of a harmful humor, removing blood could restore internal harmony. The reasoning followed their medical theory perfectly. The body was like a vessel. Remove the excess, restore balance, health would return. The procedure itself varied depending on the physician and the patient's condition. Sometimes a sharp lancet opened a vein. Other times specialized knives were used. The patient sat quietly while blood flowed into bowls or cloths. The amount removed depended upon age, health, season, and the physician's judgment. Astrology sometimes influenced the decision.
Many doctors believed the stars affected different parts of the body. Certain zodiac signs supposedly ruled specific organs. Bleeding on the wrong day could be dangerous. Bleeding under the right constellation supposedly increased success. Modern readers may find this unbelievable. Yet astrology and medicine remain closely connected throughout much of medieval Europe. Universities taught both. Educated physicians accepted both. Patients trusted both. Nobody recognized the hidden danger. An anxious person often already suffers physical exhaustion, poor sleep, rapid heartbeat, reduced appetite, constant stress. Removing blood from such a person rarely improved those problems. Instead, weakness increased, dizziness appeared, fatigue worsened. Some patients fainted during treatment. Others needed days to recover. If anxiety remained unchanged, physicians rarely blamed the treatment. Instead, they concluded that the imbalance had been especially severe. Additional bloodletting might be recommended. The cycle continued. Some patients underwent repeated bleeding sessions over months or years. Each session weakened the body a little more. Still, because anxiety naturally rises and falls over time, occasional improvements reinforced belief in the procedure. If someone felt slightly better a week after bloodletting, the physician celebrated success. No one realized the improvement might have occurred naturally. Confirmation strengthened tradition. Tradition strengthened confidence. Confidence preserved bloodletting for centuries. Not every doctor relied on bleeding alone. Another remarkable method involved purging. Physicians believed harmful substances could be expelled from the body through vomiting or powerful laxatives. Special mixtures forced the stomach or intestines to empty. The experience was exhausting. Yet doctors believed cleansing the body also cleansed the mind. To modern medicine, dehydration caused by repeated purging often creates additional physical stress. In medieval Europe, however, temporary suffering seemed worthwhile if it promised lasting healing. Sweating formed another treatment. Patients sometimes sat near intense heat or wrapped themselves in heavy blankets to encourage perspiration. Again, the goal remained purification. The body must eliminate harmful substances, whether through blood, sweat, vomiting, or bowel movements. The unhealthy humor had to leave. Many treatments reflected the same central belief. Disease came from imbalance, balance required removal. Physicians observed patients carefully throughout this process. They examined urine. Urine analysis became one of medieval medicine's most important diagnostic tools. Doctors studied its color, its smell, its clarity, its thickness, sediment collecting at the bottom. They compared samples against detailed charts. Different colors supposedly revealed different illnesses. Dark urine might suggest excessive heat. Cloudy urine indicated another imbalance. Almost every disease seemed detectable through careful observation of bodily fluids. Although inaccurate by modern standards, physicians sincerely believed they practiced careful scientific observation. Their methods represented centuries of accumulated medical tradition. For wealthy patients, treatment could become remarkably elaborate. Expensive imported spices, rare herbs, exotic ingredients from distant lands, complex medicinal syrups, professional attendants, private recovery rooms. The rich enjoyed options unavailable to ordinary villagers. Poor patients relied upon simpler remedies, common herbs gathered locally, basic dietary advice, occasional bleeding by traveling barber surgeons, help from family members. Despite these differences, everyone shared the same limited understanding of mental illness. Nobody knew anxiety originated within complex brain processes. Nobody understood trauma. Nobody understood chronic stress. Nobody understood panic disorders. They searched for physical explanations because physical explanations seemed easier to treat. Yet something curious happened. Not every physician dismissed emotional experiences entirely. Some noticed that grief often preceded illness. Others observed that prolonged fear weakened the body. Several medieval medical writers suggested excessive emotional suffering itself could contribute to disease. Although their explanations remained incorrect, these observations hinted at an important truth: mind and body influence one another. Modern medicine agrees. Chronic anxiety affects heart rate, sleep, digestion, immune function, hormones. The medieval physicians noticed these connections without understanding their biological causes. Their observations were often accurate. Their explanations were not. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of medieval anxiety treatment lies here. Doctors genuinely wanted to heal. Patients genuinely wanted to recover. Families desperately wanted their loved ones to return to normal. Everyone acted according to the best knowledge available, but knowledge has limits. And when medicine reached those limits, fear rushed in to fill the empty space. If bloodletting failed, if herbs failed, if diets failed, if purging failed, then perhaps the illness was never physical in the first place. Perhaps something invisible still held the sufferer captive. That terrifying belief would push countless anxious men and women back toward the supernatural, where whispers of curses, witchcraft, and demonic influence waited in the shadows. And for many, the treatments that followed would become even more frightening than the illness itself. The strange medicines. Medieval people trusted to calm a terrified mind. If bloodletting failed to calm a troubled mind, medieval people rarely gave up hope. Instead, they turned toward another world of healing, one filled with forests, gardens, monasteries, village wise women, traveling healers, and centuries of inherited tradition. Long before modern pharmacies existed, nature served as humanity's medicine cabinet. Every field, every woodland, every riverbank was believed to hide plants with special powers. Some eased pain, others reduced fever, some stopped bleeding. Others supposedly chased evil spirits away. For someone suffering from constant fear, sleepless nights, terrifying thoughts, or unexplained panic, herbs often seemed like the safest alternative. Unlike surgery or bloodletting, herbal medicine appeared gentle. But appearances could be deceiving. Some remedies were surprisingly effective. Others were completely useless. And a few were dangerously poisonous. Most medieval villages had at least one person known for their knowledge of plants.
Sometimes it was an elderly woman who had learned from her mother and grandmother. Sometimes it was a monk tending the monastery gardens. In larger towns, professional apothecaries prepared medicines using dried herbs, spices, oils, minerals, and animal products. Their knowledge came from many different sources. Ancient Roman medical books, Greek philosophy, Arabic medical writings, local folklore, Christian traditions, even older pagan customs that survived quietly beneath medieval society. Over hundreds of years, these ideas blended together. No one clearly separated science from superstition. Both existed side by side. A healer might prescribe lavender because it smelled calming. She might also whisper a prayer while preparing it. Neither seemed unusual. Many believed healing required both natural and spiritual power. Among the most respected herbs was chamomile. Its gentle fragrance made it popular for restless sleepers. People brewed it into warm drinks before bedtime, believing it relaxed both body and mind. Modern research suggests chamomile contains natural compounds that may promote mild relaxation. Without understanding chemistry, medieval healers had accidentally discovered something that genuinely helped some people. Another favorite was lavender. The sweet-smelling purple flowers decorated monastery gardens across Europe. Bundles hung inside homes. Small cloth bags filled with dried lavender were placed beneath pillows. Its pleasant scent was believed to drive away nightmares and fearful thoughts. Again, modern science has found that lavender aroma can reduce anxiety for some individuals. Not every medieval remedy was based entirely on imagination. Lemon balm gained another excellent reputation. Physicians believed it strengthened the heart while lifting sadness. Monks cultivated it carefully. It appeared in teas, medicinal wines, and herbal mixtures designed for melancholy. Today, lemon balm remains a popular herbal supplement for stress relief. Centuries later, its calming reputation continues. Valerian root was even stronger. Its unpleasant smell caused some people to avoid it, but healers valued its ability to encourage sleep. Patients tormented by endless nights of fear often received valerian preparations before bedtime. Modern medicine recognizes that valerian may have mild sedative effects. Although evidence remains mixed, not every medieval belief proved entirely false. Yet these genuinely useful herbs existed alongside or far stranger ingredients. Some healers believed powdered gemstones possessed healing energy. Others mixed gold leaf into medicines for wealthy patients. Crushed pearls appeared in expensive remedies. Certain minerals were believed to strengthen the spirit. No scientific evidence supported these practices. Still, they remained fashionable among Europe's elite. Animal ingredients became even stranger. The fat of particular animals supposedly healed specific illnesses. Ground antlers, burned bones, animal blood, powdered shells, even parts of exotic creatures imported from distant lands found their way into medieval medicine. The rarer the ingredient, the more powerful many people believed it to be. Sometimes, medicines became so complicated that dozens of ingredients filled a single recipe. One famous preparation known as theriac contained an astonishing mixture of herbs, spices, resins, minerals, and other substances. Originally developed in the ancient world as an antidote to poison, medieval physicians expanded its reputation dramatically. It supposedly protected against disease, it strengthened weak bodies, it treated melancholy, it fought plague. It became one of history's most famous medicines. Ironically, some versions even included small amounts of opium, meaning patients occasionally experienced genuine pain relief or sedation without anyone understanding why.
Preparing medicines required great care. Herbs were harvested during particular seasons. Some healers believed sunrise gave plants greater power. Others waited for specific phases of the moon. Astrology influenced herbal medicine almost as much as it influenced bloodletting. Every planet supposedly governed different plants. Mars ruled certain herbs. Venus ruled others. The moon affected moisture within plants.
Harvesting at the wrong time might reduce healing power. Modern readers may smile at these ideas. Yet medieval healers carefully observed nature. They noticed seasonal changes. They learned which plants grew together. They understood drying techniques that preserved herbs through winter. Their botanical knowledge often exceeded their medical knowledge. That distinction matters. Knowing plants and understanding disease are not the same thing. The medieval world excelled at the first while struggling with the second. One remarkable source of herbal knowledge came from monasteries. Monks cultivated impressive medicinal gardens. They copied medical manuscripts by hand. Many monasteries maintained hospitals where travelers and the sick received care. These institutions preserved ancient medical learning during centuries of political instability. Without their work, much classical medical knowledge might have disappeared forever. Some monasteries became famous healing centers. People traveled long distances, hoping experienced monks could cure illnesses that local healers could not. Patients received herbal remedies, nutritious meals, prayer, rest, clean clothing. Compared with many medieval villages, monasteries often provided unusually peaceful environments. Simply escaping daily hardships sometimes improved anxious patients. Unfortunately, peaceful surroundings could not cure every case. When herbs failed, people searched for stronger solutions. This search produced countless folk remedies. Some families placed protective plants above doorways. Others burned fragrant herbs to cleanse homes of evil influences. Garlic hung from ceilings. Juniper smoke filled rooms. Bundles of rosemary decorated beds. These customs blended medicine with superstition so completely that separating them became impossible. Certain flowers supposedly frightened demons. Others attracted angels. Some protected newborn children. Others defended travelers. Fear shaped every ritual. Fear demanded every precaution. People wanted certainty in an uncertain world. Charms became especially popular. Small bags filled with herbs were sewn into clothing. Pieces of parchment containing prayers were folded carefully and carried close to the heart. Tiny crosses hung around necks. Coins marked with sacred symbols became protective amulets. Many anxious people refused to leave home without them. Did these charms possess supernatural power? Modern science says no. But psychologically, they offered reassurance. Holding a familiar object during stressful moments can reduce fear. Even today, many people keep lucky objects or sentimental items that help them feel calmer. The human desire for comfort has changed very little over the centuries, yet not every healer acted honestly. Some recognized that frightened people would pay almost anything for hope. They sold miracle potions, secret recipes, rare powders, expensive oils. Promises became more valuable than evidence. Without scientific testing, no one could easily distinguish genuine herbal knowledge from fraud. Desperate families often spent precious savings chasing impossible cures. A frightened parent watching a child suffer would try almost anything. A husband, terrified for his wife, would purchase the rarest medicine he could afford. Hope became a valuable commodity. Not every treatment caused direct harm, but delay itself could be dangerous. Someone with severe anxiety might also suffer from another medical condition. Instead of receiving appropriate care, they drank herbal mixtures while the real illness continued unnoticed. Misdiagnosis remained one of medieval medicine's greatest dangers. Despite all these limitations, herbal medicine represented one of the more compassionate parts of medieval healthcare. A warm drink, a calming fragrance, a peaceful garden, gentle conversation with an experienced healer. These offered something every anxious person desperately needed: comfort. Unfortunately, comfort alone could not explain every strange behavior. Some sufferers grew worse instead of better. Some screamed through the night. Some claimed terrifying visions. Some became convinced invisible forces surrounded them. Some experienced symptoms no herb could calm. As fear spread through families and villages, whispers returned once again. Perhaps this was never ordinary illness. Perhaps plants could not help because the enemy was not inside the body, but inside the soul. And once people accepted that terrifying possibility, herbal remedies gave way to one of the most feared practices of the Middle Ages: the ritual of exorcism, when anxiety was mistaken for evil spirits. There comes a moment in every society where fear begins to search for an explanation. When medicine cannot provide answers, when herbs fail, when prayers seem powerless, when bloodletting changes nothing. People rarely accept the idea that no one knows the truth. Instead, they look for something they can understand. In medieval Europe, that answer was often the supernatural. To modern people, anxiety is linked to the brain and nervous system. To many medieval Christians, however, the invisible world was just as real as the physical one. God watched over humanity. Angels protected the faithful. Saints offered their intercession. And somewhere in the darkness, demons waited for every opportunity to attack. This was not considered folklore, it was reality. Every sermon reminded people that Satan sought to deceive mankind. Every unexplained event carried spiritual significance, Every unusual illness invited questions that medicine alone could not answer. If a person suddenly became terrified without reason, if they cried uncontrollably, if they could not sleep, if they seemed to lose control of themselves.
Some observers no longer believed they were witnessing sickness. They believed they were witnessing a spiritual battle. The idea of demonic possession did not appear overnight. It developed over centuries through biblical interpretation, church teachings, local traditions, and popular folklore. The Bible described people believed to be possessed by evil spirits. Medieval Christians accepted these accounts as historical truth. Therefore, possession remained a genuine possibility in their own lives. Most people never imagined they would encounter such a case, until someone in their own village began behaving strangely. Imagine a young woman who has suffered anxiety for months. She barely sleeps. She startles at every sound. Her breathing becomes rapid without warning. Sometimes she shakes violently. She suddenly bursts into tears. She cannot explain why she feels afraid. Her family grows frightened. Neighbors begin whispering. Someone remembers hearing a sermon about demons. Another recalls a similar case from years earlier. Soon the possibility spreads through the village. What if she is possessed? Fear moves quickly through small communities. Rumors often travel faster than facts. Within days, ordinary anxiety could become something much more terrifying. The local priest might be called. His first responsibility was usually not an exorcism. Contrary to popular myths, many priests approached these situations cautiously. They questioned the family. They observed the sufferer. They looked for signs that matched church teachings about spiritual oppression. Prayer often came first. Confession followed. Holy water was sprinkled around the home. Religious blessings were offered. Only when ordinary spiritual care appeared ineffective did more formal rituals become possible. Official exorcisms were relatively rare and usually required church approval. However, unofficial rituals were far more common. Across medieval Europe, local customs varied enormously. Some priests simply read passages from the Gospels. Others recited lengthy Latin prayers commanding evil spirits to leave. Crosses were placed against the forehead. Relics of saints rested upon the chest. Candles burned throughout the ceremony. The atmosphere itself became deeply emotional. Imagine suffering a severe panic attack while surrounded by anxious relatives, solemn priests, flickering candlelight, and whispered prayers. Your heart races faster, your breathing grows shorter, your muscles tighten, you begin trembling even more. To modern medicine, these reactions make perfect sense. The stress of the situation increases the symptoms. To medieval witnesses, however, the opposite conclusion often seemed obvious. The demon is resisting. Every scream appeared meaningful. Every trembling movement became evidence. Every collapse strengthened belief that unseen forces were fighting for control. The ritual continued, sometimes for hours, sometimes over several days. If the person eventually became exhausted and quiet, observers often celebrated. The evil spirit had finally departed.
No one recognized that physical exhaustion alone could explain the sudden calm.
In other cases, nothing changed. Fear remained, sleeplessness continued, panic returned. Now everyone faced a frightening question. Why had the exorcism failed?
Some concluded that the demon was unusually powerful. Others believed the sufferer had hidden sins that prevented healing. Still, others suspected witchcraft. Perhaps someone else had cursed the victim. Perhaps an enemy had called upon dark forces. Suddenly, one anxious person's suffering threatened the entire community. Suspicion spread. Trust disappeared. Neighbors quietly watched one another. This atmosphere of fear made everyday life incredibly difficult. Not every unusual behavior resulted from anxiety. Modern historians believe many medieval cases of supposed possession actually involved epilepsy. Others likely suffered schizophrenia. Some experienced bipolar disorder. Others had neurological diseases that medicine would not understand for centuries. Even poisoning from contaminated food could produce hallucinations and strange behavior. Without scientific knowledge, all these different conditions looked remarkably similar. They were grouped together under one terrifying explanation: possession. Despite the fear surrounding exorcisms, it is important to understand that many priests genuinely wished to help. They believed they were protecting suffering people. They believed demons were real. They believed prayer possessed tremendous power. Their intentions were often compassionate, even when their understanding proved mistaken. History becomes more meaningful when we remember that people acted according to the knowledge available to them. The tragedy lies not in their desire to heal. The tragedy lies in the limits of what they knew. While official church rituals followed established traditions, popular folklore introduced far stranger practices. Some villages believed loud church bells frightened demons. Others burned particular herbs throughout the house. Salt was scattered across doorways. Holy water mixed with local folk remedies. Ancient pagan customs blended seamlessly with Christian beliefs. Few people saw any contradiction. If something might protect the family, it seemed worth trying. Children became especially vulnerable. Young boys and girls often struggled to explain emotional distress, night terrors, panic, constant fear, nightmares. Today, many of these experiences are recognized as common childhood conditions. In medieval Europe, frightened parents sometimes feared something far darker. A child crying uncontrollably at night might receive blessings repeatedly. Prayers echoed through the home, protective symbols appeared above the bed. Parents stayed awake listening for unusual sounds. Their own fear often intensified the child's anxiety. One frightened family created another. Meanwhile, stories circulated across Europe, describing miraculous victories over demons. Traveling monks shared dramatic accounts. Pilgrims carried tales from distant shrines. Some stories undoubtedly grew more extraordinary with every retelling. The more frightening the story, the easier people remembered it. These tales reinforced existing beliefs. If demons had attacked one village, why not another? If possession happened elsewhere, why not here? Fear became contagious. Perhaps the greatest psychological burden fell upon the sufferers themselves.
Imagine believing that your own terrifying thoughts were not merely symptoms of illness, but evidence that an evil being had entered your soul. Every anxious thought became suspicious. Every nightmare became frightening proof.
Every panic attack confirmed your worst fears. Instead of asking, "Why am I anxious?" you asked, "What has taken control of me?" That belief could become overwhelming. Some people isolated themselves from others. Others refused to attend public gatherings. Some spent countless hours praying, terrified that any moment of weakness would invite further spiritual attack. Anxiety fed religious fear. Religious fear fed anxiety.
The cycle became almost impossible to escape. As the centuries passed, the church gradually became more cautious about declaring possession. Many church leaders recognized that not every unusual behavior involved demons. Even during the Middle Ages, opinions differed. Some clergy urged patience. Others demanded medical examination before spiritual judgment. But local communities often followed tradition more than official guidance. What happened in one village could differ dramatically from another. Unfortunately, the fear of invisible evil would soon merge with another growing fear. Not just demons, but the people supposedly working with them. The rise of witchcraft accusations would transform anxiety from a personal tragedy into a public danger. A frightened person was no longer simply someone in need of help. They could become evidence that a witch was living nearby. And once that idea took hold, entire communities would begin searching for someone to blame. Witches, curses, and the terrifying search for someone to blame. Fear rarely remains contained within one person. It spreads. A frightened individual worries about their own future. A frightened family worries about one another.
A frightened village begins looking for a reason. During the Middle Ages, when anxiety refused to disappear, despite prayers, herbs, bloodletting, or exorcisms, many communities reached a dangerous conclusion. Someone must be responsible. Not disease, not the mind, not the brain. Another person. That belief marked the beginning of one of medieval Europe's darkest chapters. The idea of harmful magic had existed long before the Middle Ages. Ancient civilizations believed that curses, charms, and supernatural forces could influence human life. By medieval times, these older beliefs had blended with Christian teachings about the devil and evil spirits. The result was terrifying. If an otherwise healthy person suddenly became consumed by fear, if they suffered nightmares every night, if they screamed in their sleep, if they claimed to feel an invisible presence, some people no longer believed these experiences happened naturally. Instead, they asked a frightening question. Who did this? The search for an answer often began quietly. Perhaps there had been an argument with a neighbor. Perhaps someone had refused to lend food during a famine. Perhaps an elderly woman lived alone at the edge of the village. Perhaps a traveling stranger had recently passed through. In communities already overwhelmed by hunger, disease, and uncertainty, Suspicion found fertile ground. People noticed small coincidences.
A child became ill after visiting a certain house. A cow stopped producing milk. A family's crops failed. Someone developed severe anxiety. Individually, these events meant very little. Together, they formed a story. Human beings naturally look for patterns, even when none exist. This tendency helped our ancestors survive real dangers, but it also led to terrible mistakes. Medieval villagers did not understand psychological illness. They did understand stories. Stories gave suffering a cause. Stories identified villains. Stories offered simple explanations for complicated problems. Once fear became connected to witchcraft, nearly every unusual event appeared suspicious. A woman skilled in herbal medicine suddenly attracted unwanted attention. For generations, she had treated headaches, fevers, childbirth, and wounds. People respected her knowledge. But if one patient recovered while another did not, whispers began. Where did she learn these herbs? Why does she know so much? Could her medicines hide darker secrets? The same knowledge that once earned admiration could now inspire fear. Ironically, many of these women preserved valuable medical traditions. Without them, countless ordinary illnesses would have gone untreated. Yet their understanding of plants sometimes made them targets, especially when frightened communities demanded someone to blame. It is important to remember that the most intense witch hunts occurred mainly during the late medieval and early modern periods, not throughout the entire Middle Ages. Still, belief in curses and harmful magic existed long before the Great Witch Trials. Ordinary people often carried protective charms against imagined curses. Horseshoes hung above doors. Small crosses decorated homes. Blessed candles burned through the night. Holy water was sprinkled around fields. Families believed these actions shielded them from unseen enemies. An anxious person living in such an environment experienced fear on multiple levels. They feared their own terrifying thoughts. They feared demons. They feared divine punishment. And now they feared witches. Every unexplained sensation seemed dangerous. If they woke with a racing heart, perhaps a curse had taken hold. If nightmares continued, perhaps someone wished them harm. If panic struck while walking alone, perhaps evil magic followed them. Modern psychology shows that expectation can influence perception. When people expect danger, ordinary experiences often feel extraordinary. A sudden noise becomes a threat. A shadow becomes a figure. A normal heartbeat feels abnormal. Medieval people interpreted these sensations through the beliefs surrounding them. Their fear felt completely real. Religious objects became even more important. Some carried relics, believed to protect against curses. Others wore medals engraved with saints. Written prayers were folded into tiny packets and sewn inside clothing. Parents placed blessed objects beneath children's pillows. Travelers refused to begin journeys without receiving a blessing. These rituals offered reassurance. They created the comforting feeling that something stood between the family and invisible danger. That emotional comfort should not be underestimated. Even today, many people find strength in meaningful rituals during periods of stress. The difference lies in understanding why they help. Modern psychology explains them through emotional support and perceived control. Medieval society often explained them through supernatural protection. Not everyone accused others of witchcraft. Many priests urged caution. Some physicians insisted that natural illness should be considered before supernatural explanations. Even among educated people, disagreements existed. But education spread slowly. Most villagers depended on local traditions passed from one generation to another. Rumors often carried greater influence than evidence. Fear traveled faster than reason. Imagine living in a village where 3 families suddenly experienced frightening illnesses. One person developed seizures. Another became deeply depressed. A third suffered relentless panic attacks. Without medical knowledge, these unrelated conditions seemed connected. People searched desperately for a common cause. Soon someone remembered an old disagreement with a widow living outside the village. Another claimed to have seen her gathering herbs at night. A child insisted she spoke strangely. Within days, suspicion hardened into certainty. No proof existed, yet belief alone transformed lives. For the accused, the consequences could be devastating: isolation, public shame, fear, sometimes violence. Communities that once worked together now viewed neighbors with suspicion. Trust slowly disappeared. Anxiety itself became contagious. When everyone believes unseen dangers surround them, everyone begins watching for signs. Every unusual dream, every strange illness, every unexplained death, every failed harvest, everything demanded an explanation. Ironically, the more frightened society became, the more anxiety spread. Fear created the very symptoms people interpreted as evidence of supernatural attack. A frightened child slept poorly. Poor sleep caused exhaustion. Exhaustion increased anxiety. Anxiety produced nightmares. Nightmares confirmed supernatural fears. The cycle repeated endlessly. Some monasteries offered a different environment. Within their walls, sufferers sometimes found quiet routines, regular meals, prayer, work, and relative safety from village rumors. For certain anxious individuals, this stability proved genuinely comforting. Although monks misunderstood the medical causes of anxiety, their structured daily life occasionally reduced emotional distress. Routine can calm the human mind. That truth remains valid today. Outside monastery walls, however, medieval life continued to be unpredictable. Wars erupted without warning. Famine returned again and again. Disease spread rapidly through crowded towns. Death visited nearly every household. Against such a backdrop, anxiety was not an unusual response. It was a deeply human one. The tragedy was that people rarely recognized it as such. Instead of seeing a frightened mind struggling to cope with overwhelming hardship, they often saw signs of invisible enemies, curses, or hidden evil. Yet perhaps the cruelest misunderstanding was still to come, because some anxious sufferers were not merely feared. They were locked away, restrained, punished, or treated as if their illness itself had become a crime. For many medieval men and women, the next chapter of their suffering would begin not with healing, but with confinement, madness, confinement, and punishment, when anxiety was treated like a crime. By the time an anxious person had endured prayers, herbal remedies, bloodletting, fasting, and perhaps even an exorcism, there was one terrifying possibility left. People stopped asking how to cure them. Instead, they began asking how to control them. This marked one of the darkest realities of medieval mental illness. Not because every anxious person was imprisoned or abused. Most were not. Many remained with their families for their entire lives. But for those whose fear became overwhelming, whose panic attacks, emotional breakdowns, or unusual behavior frightened the people around them, life could become far more difficult. The medieval world had no understanding of panic disorder, no diagnosis for generalized anxiety disorder, no concept of post-traumatic stress, no psychologists, no psychiatrists, no counseling centers. Instead, there was a broad and frightening idea: madness. That single word covered an enormous range of conditions. A person suffering from schizophrenia, someone with epilepsy, an individual with dementia, a survivor of severe trauma, someone experiencing deep depression, a person overwhelmed by anxiety. All could, at different times, be described as mad. To medieval society, the differences between these illnesses were rarely clear. What mattered most was behavior. Could the person work? Could they pray? Could they obey authority? Could they live peacefully within the community? If the answer was yes, families usually cared for them themselves. Family was the first and most important support system. Parents looked after children. Children cared for aging parents. Husbands cared for wives. Wives cared for husbands. Brothers and sisters helped one another whenever possible. Contrary to popular myths, medieval families did not automatically abandon relatives with mental illness. Many showed extraordinary patience, despite having almost no medical knowledge. Imagine a mother sitting beside her frightened son through another sleepless night. She cannot explain why he trembles. She does not know what causes his panic. But she stays beside him anyway. She offers warm broth. She whispers prayers. She holds his hand. Her love is real, even if her understanding is limited. Thousands of families throughout medieval Europe lived exactly this way. But not every family had the resources to provide constant care. Life itself demanded endless labor. Fields had to be planted. Animals needed feeding. Water had to be carried. Wood had to be chopped. Bread had to be baked. If one family member became unable to work for months or years, survival itself could become uncertain. Poverty transformed illness into a community problem. An anxious person who could no longer leave home placed enormous pressure on everyone around them. The family faced an impossible choice: continue caring for them despite growing hardship, or seek help elsewhere. And sometimes that help came from monasteries. Some religious communities accepted individuals who needed long-term care. The atmosphere varied greatly. Certain monasteries emphasized kindness, prayer, routine, and quiet work.
Others possessed fewer resources and struggled simply to feed everyone under their care. Conditions depended entirely on the place, the people, and the era. There was no universal medieval system. In larger towns, hospitals slowly began to appear. The word hospital meant something very different from today. These institutions cared for travelers, the poor, the elderly, the sick, and occasionally those suffering from mental disturbances. Medical treatment remained extremely limited. Rest, food, prayer, basic nursing. These formed the foundation of care. Some patients improved simply because they escaped the hardships of ordinary life. Others remained ill despite every effort. The greatest challenge came when fear turned into behavior that frightened others. Imagine someone suffering repeated panic attacks in a crowded marketplace. They suddenly scream. They collapse. They struggle to breathe. People gather. No one understands what is happening. Some believe they are dying. Others suspect possession. Children begin crying. Adults step backward. Within moments, confusion spreads through the crowd. Modern medicine would recognize a medical emergency requiring reassurance and appropriate care. Medieval observers often reached different conclusions. If similar episodes happened repeatedly, local authorities sometimes intervened, not always with cruelty, often simply to restore public order. In certain cases, individuals were temporarily restrained. Ropes might be used, wooden stocks, locked rooms, whatever prevented harm to themselves or others. Today, these methods appear harsh, and often they were. Yet many communities genuinely believed restraint protected both the sufferer and everyone nearby. Without effective treatment, they saw few alternatives. Some physicians recommended isolation, a quiet room, minimal stimulation, limited visitors. Occasionally, this helped. Someone overwhelmed by constant noise and activity might indeed become calmer in peaceful surroundings, but prolonged isolation carried serious psychological costs. Loneliness deepened despair. Silence magnified fearful thoughts. Days blended into weeks, weeks into months. For an already anxious mind, isolation often became another source of suffering. Another common misunderstanding involved sleep. Many anxious individuals barely slept at all. Night after night, they remained awake. Exhaustion accumulated. Hallucinations sometimes followed. Modern science knows that severe sleep deprivation alone can produce confusion, emotional instability, and even frightening visions. Medieval observers rarely recognized the connection. Instead, worsening symptoms seemed to confirm supernatural explanations. Another prayer was offered, another exorcism attempted, another round of bloodletting performed. The cycle continued. There were also moments of surprising humanity. Some physicians noticed that music soothed distressed patients, soft singing, simple instruments, religious hymns. Even without understanding the brain, they observed that certain sounds calmed emotional suffering. Today, music therapy remains a respected field. Again, medieval observation occasionally pointed toward truths science would confirm centuries later. Gardens offered another unexpected refuge. Monasteries encouraged gentle outdoor work. Tending herbs, watering plants
walking among trees. Quiet physical activity sometimes eased troubled minds. Modern psychology similarly recognizes the mental health benefits of nature. Not every medieval practice was harmful. Some succeeded despite incorrect explanations. The problem was inconsistency. Compassion depended almost entirely upon where someone lived and who cared for them. A patient fortunate enough to encounter a thoughtful monk experienced something very different from someone living in a fearful village dominated by superstition.
There were no standardized treatments, no medical guidelines, no scientific research. Everything depended upon individual belief. As centuries passed, stories of extraordinary madness spread rapidly across Europe. Travelers carried dramatic tales from one kingdom to another. A man who claimed invisible voices followed him. A woman who screamed throughout the night. A child terrified by things no one else could see. Each story grew larger with every retelling. Fear fascinated people, and fear sold stories. Unfortunately, these dramatic accounts overshadowed countless quieter cases. The farmer who silently worried every day. The widow unable to sleep after losing her husband. The young mother overwhelmed by constant fear for her children. The soldier haunted by memories of war. These people rarely appeared in chronicles. History remembered the extraordinary and often forgot the ordinary. Yet ordinary anxiety almost certainly affected medieval life every single day. People simply lacked the language to describe it. Instead, they spoke of melancholy, weakness, temptation, possession, or madness. Words shaped understanding. Understanding shaped treatment. And treatment shaped lives. Perhaps the greatest tragedy is this. Many anxious people were never dangerous at all. They posed no threat to anyone. They simply suffered in silence. But silence was difficult to understand in a world searching constantly for visible explanations. As the Middle Ages drew towards their later centuries, another force would begin changing medicine forever. Scholars started questioning old ideas. Ancient books were re-examined. Human anatomy received closer study. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the first cracks appeared in the ancient theory of the four humors. The journey toward modern understanding had begun. But before science could finally separate anxiety from sin, possession, and madness, millions more would continue living in fear of illnesses no one truly understood. How medieval ideas slowly gave way to the first scientific understanding of anxiety. For hundreds of years, medieval Europe believed that anxiety was caused by sin, demonic influence, an imbalance of the four humors, or some mysterious force that lay beyond human understanding. These ideas shaped medicine, they shaped religion, they shaped families, and they shaped the lives of countless ordinary people. But history never stands still. Even during the Middle Ages, small changes were already beginning. They were quiet, almost invisible. Few people noticed them at first. Yet those tiny changes would eventually transform the way humanity understood the human mind. The shift did not happen because someone suddenly discovered the truth. It happened because thousands of scholars, physicians, monks, translators, and curious observers slowly began asking better questions. Instead of accepting every ancient belief without challenge, some physicians started comparing old theories with their own observations. Sometimes what they saw did not match what the books described. Patients behaved differently. Treatments failed. Recovery often happened unexpectedly. The more carefully doctors watched real people, the more difficult it became to explain every illness using only the four humors. This change was incredibly slow. A medieval physician did not wake up one morning and reject centuries of tradition. Ancient authorities like Hippocrates and Galen were deeply respected. Questioning them required courage. After all, if these famous scholars had been trusted for over 1,000 years, why would anyone believe an ordinary physician instead? Yet experience has a way of challenging certainty. Doctors noticed that two patients with almost identical symptoms sometimes responded very differently to the same treatment. One improved, the other became worse. If bloodletting truly restored balance every time, why did it fail so often? If black bile caused every fearful thought, why did some anxious people recover without any treatment at all? Questions slowly multiplied. Meanwhile, another important development was taking place. Across Europe, universities continued to grow. Young scholars gathered to study medicine, philosophy, theology, and law. Books were copied more widely than before. Knowledge traveled farther than it had in previous centuries. Although education remained limited to a small portion of society, ideas began moving between countries with greater speed. Perhaps the most important influence came from the Islamic world. While much of Europe struggled through political instability, scholars in cities such as Baghdad, Cordoba, Cairo, and Damascus preserved and expanded the medical knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. They translated forgotten texts. They corrected errors. They added their own observations. They wrote detailed medical encyclopedias that would eventually reach Europe. Medieval European physicians learned enormously from these works. Medical knowledge did not develop in isolation. It crossed borders, it crossed languages, it crossed religions. This exchange helped preserve ideas that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Hospitals also became more organized. Although they still looked nothing like modern hospitals, some institutions began keeping better records of patients and treatments. Observation slowly became more important. Instead of relying entirely on tradition, physicians increasingly paid attention to what actually happened. This simple habit, careful observation, would eventually become one of science's greatest strengths. Even so, anxiety remained deeply misunderstood. Doctors could describe its symptoms. They could recognize fear. They could see trembling hands, racing hearts, sleepless nights, and overwhelming sadness. But they still could not explain why these experiences occurred. The brain remained largely mysterious. Human dissection was still limited in many places. No one understood neurons. No one knew about hormones. No one had discovered the nervous system as we understand it today. The greatest mystery remained hidden inside the human skull. Religion also continued to play a central role. For many people, faith remained a source of genuine comfort. Monasteries continued caring for the sick. Priests continued offering hope to frightened families. Prayer remained an important part of everyday life. History is rarely simple.
Religion sometimes increased anxiety by encouraging fear of sin and punishment. At other times, it reduced anxiety by offering hope, community, forgiveness, and emotional support. Both realities existed at the same time. The human experience has always been more complicated than simple stories allow. As Europe slowly approached the end of the medieval period, another great transformation appeared on the horizon. The Renaissance. Interest in direct observation increased. Artists studied the human body. Scientists questioned ancient assumptions. Printers spread books more rapidly than ever before after the invention of the printing press. Knowledge that once remained hidden inside monasteries could now travel across entire continents. Ideas spread faster. Mistakes became easier to challenge. New discoveries reached more people. This did not immediately solve the mystery of anxiety. Far from it. Even centuries after the Middle Ages ended, physicians continued using bloodletting. Many still believed in the four humors. Superstitions survived. Exorcisms continued. Progress was gradual, but the direction had changed. Instead of relying only on authority, more scholars began relying on evidence. That shift would eventually reshape medicine forever. Looking back today, it is tempting to laugh at medieval treatments. Bloodletting seems absurd. Exorcisms appear frightening. Protective charms feel superstitious, but doing so risks missing an important lesson. The people of the Middle Ages were not foolish, they were human. They searched for answers using the knowledge available to them. When someone they loved suffered terrifying fear, they wanted to help. They prayed because they believed prayer healed. They used herbs because generations had trusted them. They followed physicians because doctors represented the best science of their age. They made mistakes, terrible mistakes. But those mistakes were built upon sincere attempts to understand a world that remained largely mysterious. Modern medicine stands on centuries of trial and error. Every discovery replaced an older misunderstanding. Every generation believed it understood more than the one before. History reminds us that certainty should always be accompanied by humility. Even today, scientists continue learning about anxiety. Researchers still study how genetics, trauma, childhood experiences, environment, hormones, sleep, and brain chemistry interact. There is still much we do not know. Future generations may one day look back at some of our current treatments with the same surprise that we feel when reading about medieval bloodletting. That possibility encourages caution, it encourages curiosity, and above all, it encourages compassion. Perhaps that is the greatest difference between the medieval world and our own. Today, when someone says they are struggling with anxiety, we are far more likely to ask one question: how can we help? Rather than, what sin caused this? Or, who cursed you? Or, Which demon has entered your soul? That change did not happen overnight. It took centuries of observation, debate, failure, and discovery. Millions of people lived and died before humanity finally began separating mental illness from superstition. Their suffering became part of the long road toward understanding. Their stories remind us how precious knowledge truly is. Because when fear is misunderstood, treatment itself can become another source of suffering. And when compassion is guided by evidence, healing becomes possible. The horrifying truth about medieval anxiety treatments is not simply that many of them were painful. It is that they reflected humanity's desperate attempt to explain an invisible illness without the scientific tools needed to understand it. That history deserves to be remembered. Not to mock those who came before us, but to appreciate how far medicine has come. And to remember that every person living with anxiety, whether in the Middle Ages or today, deserves understanding, dignity, and hope. Life inside medieval monasteries. Did religious healing actually work? For many people in medieval Europe, there was one place that seemed quieter than the noisy streets of growing towns, safer than isolated villages, and more peaceful than the battlefields and uncertain roads that connected the kingdoms.
The monastery. Behind its thick stone walls, life moved according to a strict routine. Church bells marked every hour. Monks rose before sunrise. Prayers filled the cold morning air. Meals were simple. Conversations were limited. Every day followed nearly the same pattern as the day before. To modernize, it may seem like a place of complete silence. But for many medieval people, it was something even more important. It was a place of refuge. When someone struggled with overwhelming fear, endless sadness, sleepless nights, or emotional exhaustion, families sometimes hoped that life inside a monastery might succeed where every other treatment had failed. The monks were not psychiatrists. They knew nothing about anxiety disorders or brain chemistry. Yet they possessed something that many ordinary people lacked: time, patience, education, and in some monasteries, a sincere desire to care for those who were suffering. Unlike most villages, monasteries followed an organized daily schedule. Long before modern psychologists understood the importance of routine, monks lived according to one. They woke at nearly the same hour every day. They prayed together. They worked together. They ate together. They rested at predictable times. Nothing happened randomly. For someone living with constant anxiety, this predictable rhythm could feel comforting. The outside world was full of uncertainty. A war could begin without warning. A harvest could fail overnight. Disease could spread through an entire village in days. Inside the monastery, however, life changed very slowly. Every sunrise looked much like the one before. Many monasteries also provided something rare in medieval Europe: regular meals. Most ordinary families depended entirely on successful harvests. During years of famine, food became scarce. Malnutrition weakened both the body and the mind. Modern medicine recognizes that poor nutrition can worsen anxiety, increase fatigue, and make emotional suffering more difficult to manage. The monks did not understand these biological connections. Still, by offering consistent meals, they sometimes improved a person's overall health without realizing why. Their diet remained simple: bread, vegetables, beans, fish on many days, occasionally cheese, sometimes fruit when available. Feasts were rare, luxury was discouraged. Moderation formed the foundation of monastic life. For anxious visitors, accustomed to hunger and uncertainty, even this modest stability could provide relief. Sleep also improved inside many monasteries. In medieval villages, fear often interrupted the night. Dogs barked. Storms damaged fragile homes. Bandits threatened isolated communities. Families worried constantly about survival. Within monastery walls, life felt more secure. Heavy stone buildings protected residents from much of the outside world. Night watches guarded the entrances. Regular schedules encouraged healthier sleeping habits. Again, monks did not understand sleep science, yet their lifestyle accidentally supported better rest for many people. Work formed another important part of monastic healing. Every monk had responsibilities. Some copied manuscripts, others tended gardens, some brewed medicines, others baked bread. Many cared for animals. Physical labor was considered an act of devotion. Visitors capable of working often joined these daily tasks. Modern psychology recognizes that meaningful activity can reduce anxious rumination. Keeping the hands busy sometimes quiets an overactive mind. The monks explained this through spiritual discipline. Today we describe it differently, yet the result could be remarkably similar. The monastery gardens deserve special attention. They were far more than decorative spaces. These gardens served as living pharmacies. Rows of medicinal herbs grew carefully under the monks' supervision. Chamomile, lavender, sage, rosemary, mint, valerian, lemon balm. Many of the same herbs discussed earlier were cultivated with remarkable care. The monks studied how to grow them, when to harvest them, how to dry them, how to prepare them for patients. Although they misunderstood many illnesses, their botanical knowledge became one of medieval Europe's greatest medical resources. Some monasteries copied ancient medical texts describing hundreds of plants. Without these handwritten books, much classical herbal knowledge might have disappeared forever. Patients often received warm herbal infusions before bed, not because anyone understood neurotransmitters, but because generations of experience suggested certain plants helped restless people sleep. Sometimes experience reached the correct conclusion long before science explained why. Conversation also played an unexpected role. Confession remained central to monastic life. Visitors often spoke privately with experienced monks. They described fears, guilt, nightmares, doubts, grief. The monk listened carefully before offering spiritual advice. Modern readers may notice an interesting similarity. Speaking openly about emotional suffering often reduces its burden. Therapists today use structured conversation to help patients understand their thoughts. Confession pursued different goals, focusing on the soul rather than psychology. Yet the simple act of expressing hidden fears could still provide genuine emotional relief. Not every monastery offered the same experience. Some welcomed travelers generously. Others possessed few resources. Certain religious communities became famous for caring for the sick. Others focused almost entirely on prayer and scholarship. Conditions depended greatly upon the location, the order, and the personalities of the monks themselves. History was never uniform. There were compassionate communities. There were strict communities. There were wealthy monasteries. There were poor ones. Generalizations rarely tell the full story. Despite these positive aspects, monasteries could not cure anxiety. Some visitors improved during their stay. Others remained frightened despite weeks or months of prayer and routine. When healing failed to appear, explanations usually remained spiritual. Perhaps God was testing their faith. Perhaps hidden sins remained unconfessed. Perhaps greater patience was required. Medical uncertainty continued. The limits of medieval knowledge remained impossible to escape. Some monasteries also practiced treatments we would now consider harmful. Bloodletting still occurred. Strict fasting remained common during religious seasons. Long periods of silence sometimes deepened loneliness instead of relieving it. Again, the same place could offer comfort to one person and suffering to another. One remarkable feature of monastic life was reading. Books were precious treasures. Many monks spent years copying manuscripts by hand. Visitors rarely possess such opportunities. Listening to scripture, history, or religious writings gave some anxious individuals a welcome distraction from endless fearful thoughts. Stories provided hope, examples of perseverance, promises that suffering could have meaning. Whether one shares those religious beliefs or not, hope itself can become a powerful source of emotional resilience. Perhaps the greatest strength of monastic care was community. No one faced daily life entirely alone. Meals were shared, work was shared, prayer was shared. Silence itself was shared. Modern research consistently shows that social isolation increases the risk of anxiety and depression. Meaningful human connection remains one of the strongest protective factors for mental health. The monks understood community through faith. Modern psychology understands it through neuroscience and social behavior. Different explanations, but often similar observations. Still, monasteries represented only one small part of medieval society. Most people never lived within their walls. Most anxious men and women remained farmers, craftsmen, merchants, servants, soldiers, or nobles struggling with the same invisible fears outside monastery gates. Their experiences depended greatly upon wealth, because in medieval Europe, money could not eliminate anxiety, but it could dramatically change how that anxiety was treated. The rich and the poor lived in completely different worlds. They ate different food, visited different physicians, received different medicines, and faced very different chances of survival. In the next chapter, we will discover how social class shaped medieval anxiety treatments, and why wealth sometimes brought better care, but not always greater peace of mind. How wealth determined medieval anxiety treatments.
If anxiety could strike anyone, regardless of age, occupation, or social status, then one question naturally follows. Did everyone receive the same treatment? The answer is no. In medieval Europe, your chances of receiving care depended greatly on one thing: your place in society. A king and a peasant could both spend sleepless nights fearing the future. A noblewoman and a farmer's wife could both experience overwhelming panic. A wealthy merchant and a village blacksmith could both suffer from relentless worry. The illness did not care about wealth, but the treatment certainly did. Medieval society was built upon strict social classes. At the top stood kings, queens, princes, and great nobles. Below them came knights and lesser nobles, then merchants, craftsmen, and skilled workers. Finally came the vast majority of the population, peasants who worked the land. Each group lived very different lives. Each faced different dangers, and each encountered different kinds of medical care. For the poor, life itself created constant anxiety. Most peasant families owned very little. A single failed harvest could mean hunger. 2 failed harvests could mean starvation. If a family's only ox died, months of work could disappear overnight. If heavy rain destroyed the crops, there was no insurance. If disease struck the livestock, there was rarely a second chance. Every season carried uncertainty. Spring brought hope, but also the fear of frost. Summer promised growth, but storms could flatten entire fields. Autumn determined survival through the winter. Winter tested whether enough food had been stored. Anxiety was not an occasional visitor. For many peasants, it was woven into everyday life. Medical care remained a luxury. Most villages had no trained physician. Instead, people relied upon family traditions, local herbalists, village healers, or the parish priest. Payment was not always made with coins. A healer might receive bread, a chicken, firewood, or help during harvest. These informal arrangements allowed poor families to receive some assistance, but advanced medical treatment remained far beyond their reach. If bloodletting was required, a traveling barber surgeon might visit only occasionally. If expensive herbs were needed, they often could not be purchased. If a physician lived several days away, transportation itself became a problem. Many poor people simply endured anxiety without professional help. Life demanded work, even when fear consumed them. A farmer experiencing constant panic still had to plow the fields. A mother struggling with sleepless nights still had to feed her children. There were no sick leave policies, no disability benefits, no mental health services. Survival came first. Emotional suffering often remained invisible. Yet the wealthy lived in a very different world. Nobles possessed resources unavailable to ordinary villagers. They could summon physicians directly to their castles. Some employed personal doctors. Others consulted the finest medical minds available in large cities. These physicians carried books, instruments, and access to imported medicines. Rare herbs arrived from distant lands. Spices traveled across continents,
Expensive ingredients unavailable to ordinary people appeared in noble households. If one treatment failed, another could be attempted. Money created options. But wealth did not guarantee success. In fact, noble patients sometimes endured even more elaborate and dangerous procedures. A wealthy lord suffering anxiety might undergo repeated bloodletting because his physician wished to demonstrate his medical expertise. Complex medicines containing dozens of ingredients were prepared at enormous expense. Rare minerals, imported resins, exotic spices, powdered pearls, even gold leaf occasionally appeared in expensive remedies. The more unusual the medicine, the more impressive it seemed. Unfortunately, impressive did not always mean effective. Some wealthy patients became victims of excessive treatment. Physicians eager to satisfy powerful patrons sometimes prescribed intervention after intervention, bloodletting, purging, strict diets, medicinal wines, astrological consultations, lengthy fasting. The patient suffered through each one. Meanwhile, the underlying anxiety often remained unchanged. Royal courts presented their own unique pressures. Kings ruled kingdoms filled with political rivals. Assassination remained a genuine danger. Rebellions erupted unexpectedly. Foreign armies threatened borders. Every decision affected thousands of lives. Living under constant political pressure created enormous emotional strain. Historical records occasionally describe rulers who struggled with intense fear, deep melancholy, or emotional instability. Medieval physicians treated these powerful individuals using the same basic theories applied to everyone else: black bile, humoral imbalance, religious devotion, herbal medicine. Status changed comfort. It did not change medical understanding. Queens and noble women faced different anxieties. Marriage often served political purposes. Childbirth remained extremely dangerous. Producing healthy heirs became both a personal and political responsibility. The death of an infant carried heartbreaking emotional consequences. Repeated pregnancies placed tremendous stress on both body and mind. Modern medicine recognizes that pregnancy and childbirth can significantly affect mental health. The Middle Ages possessed no such understanding. Postpartum anxiety or depression often received spiritual or humoral explanations instead. Some women recovered naturally. Others suffered in silence. Children, regardless of wealth, faced their own fears. Noble children grew up surrounded by expectations. Future rulers began training almost from birth. Boys prepared for warfare. Girls prepared for marriage and household management. Peasant children worked alongside their parents from an early age. Responsibility arrived quickly for everyone. Few adults recognized childhood anxiety as a separate condition. Fear was expected. Obedience mattered more. One remarkable difference between rich and poor involved literacy. Educated nobles could read devotional books, medical texts, or philosophical works. Reading sometimes offered distraction, reflection, or comfort. Most peasants depended entirely upon spoken knowledge. Stories, sermons, songs, oral tradition shaped their understanding of illness. Different access to information created different ways of interpreting anxiety.
The wealthy also possessed another important advantage. Time. A noble recovering from illness could remain inside a castle for weeks. Servants continued daily work. Fields still produced income through tenants. A peasant possessed no such luxury. Missing even a few days of labor could threaten the family's survival. This constant pressure often prevented rest precisely when it was needed most. Despite these enormous differences, anxiety remained strangely democratic. It ignored wealth, ignored titles, ignored castles, ignored crowns. Invisible fear crossed every social boundary. Even monks, who had renounced worldly possessions, sometimes wrote about spiritual despair, overwhelming doubt, and emotional suffering. No social class escaped entirely. Perhaps that is the most important lesson. Medieval medicine treated rich and poor differently. Society valued them differently. Opportunity differed dramatically. But the human mind remained the same. Fear belonged to everyone. As the centuries passed, Europe would face one catastrophe greater than almost any before it. A disaster so immense that physicians, priests, kings, peasants, and monks all found themselves equally powerless. The arrival of the Black Death. It would kill millions, destroy entire communities, and leave psychological scars that lasted for generations. For those already struggling with anxiety, it transformed everyday fear into something almost impossible to imagine. The legacy of medieval anxiety treatments, what history teaches us today. The story of medieval anxiety treatments is not really a story about strange medicines, frightening rituals, or outdated beliefs. Those are only the surface. The deeper story is about something that has remained unchanged throughout all of human history. Fear. Every generation has known it. Every civilization has struggled to understand it. Every society has searched for ways to overcome it. The Middle Ages were no different. A farmer standing in a muddy field nearly 1,000 years ago could feel the same racing heartbeat that someone experiences today before an important examination. A mother worried about her child's survival felt the same overwhelming concern that parents still experience. A soldier preparing for battle knew the same uncertainty that countless soldiers have faced across history. The physical sensations of anxiety have changed very little. The human body is still the human body. The difference lies in how people explain those sensations. For medieval Europeans, knowledge had limits. The brain remained mysterious. The nervous system was unknown. Hormones had not yet been discovered. Psychology did not exist. Neuroscience was centuries away. When people encountered invisible suffering, they naturally explained it using the beliefs available to them. Religion, humoral medicine, superstition, folklore, astrology, magic. These ideas filled the gaps left by science. Sometimes those explanations comforted people, prayer gave hope, community reduced loneliness, monasteries provided safety, herbal remedies occasionally eased symptoms, family support helped countless sufferers endure difficult times. Not everything about medieval care was cruel. History is more complicated than simple myths suggest. Many priests acted with sincere compassion. Many physicians genuinely wanted to heal. Many herbalists spent their entire lives helping neighbors with the knowledge they possessed. Many families cared lovingly for relatives despite overwhelming hardship. Their intentions deserve respect. Their understanding, however, remained incomplete, and incomplete knowledge often produced tragic consequences. Bloodletting weakened already exhausted patients. Repeated fasting sometimes worsened emotional suffering. Exorcisms frightened people experiencing ordinary panic attacks. Superstitions encouraged communities to search for invisible enemies instead of real medical causes. Some individuals were isolated, others were misunderstood. Some were even blamed for illnesses they never caused. The greatest tragedy was not cruelty alone, it was confusion. People desperately wanted answers, but the answers they possessed were often wrong. History reminds us that good intentions cannot replace accurate knowledge. Compassion is essential, but compassion guided by evidence is even more powerful. As Europe gradually left the Middle Ages behind, medicine continued changing. The Renaissance encouraged direct observation. The scientific revolution emphasized experimentation. Anatomists studied the human body in greater detail. Physicians slowly abandoned ancient assumptions. Centuries later, psychology emerged as a scientific discipline. Researchers explored memory, emotion, learning, and behavior. Neurologists uncovered the complexity of the brain. Psychiatrists developed new approaches to mental illness. None of these advances happened quickly. Progress required hundreds of years, countless mistakes, endless debate, continuous observation. Even today, anxiety remains one of the world's most common mental health conditions. Scientists continue studying why it develops. Some factors appear genetic. Others involve childhood experiences, trauma, stress, sleep, physical health, environment. No single explanation fits every person. In that sense, humanity is still learning. Perhaps future generations will discover treatments that seem extraordinary compared to today's medicine. History teaches humility. Every age believes it understands the human body. Every age later discovers how much remained unknown. That lesson encourages curiosity. Instead of arrogance, it reminds us to keep questioning, to keep researching, to keep listening. One remarkable difference separates our world from much of the medieval one. Today, anxiety is increasingly recognized as a medical condition rather than a moral failure. Someone experiencing panic attacks is not assumed to be possessed by evil spirits. Persistent fear is not automatically treated as evidence of divine punishment. Most people no longer blame curses or witchcraft for invisible emotional suffering. Instead, healthcare professionals seek biological, psychological, and social explanations. This change represents one of medicine's greatest achievements. Equally important is the growing understanding that recovery rarely depends upon one single treatment. Some people benefit from therapy. Others require medication. Many improve through exercise, healthy sleep, supportive relationships, stress management, or combinations of several approaches. Healing is often personal. There is no universal cure. That realization itself marks enormous progress. Modern medicine
accepts uncertainty far more comfortably than medieval medicine could. Perhaps the greatest lesson from medieval anxiety treatments is not about the past. It is about the present. When people misunderstand invisible illnesses, suffering becomes heavier. When fear is judged instead of understood, recovery becomes harder. When compassion disappears, pain grows. These lessons remain relevant today. Although science has advanced dramatically, stigma surrounding mental illness has not disappeared completely. Many people still hesitate to speak openly about anxiety. Some fear being misunderstood. Others worry about appearing weak. History encourages us to respond differently. Not with judgment, but with empathy. Not with blame, but with understanding. Not with superstition, but with evidence. And not with fear, but with hope. The medieval world often searched for monsters hidden in the darkness. Today we understand that the greatest mystery was never a demon, a curse, or an imbalance of imaginary humors. It was the human mind itself. A mind capable of extraordinary courage, profound compassion, remarkable resilience, and at times overwhelming fear. Understanding that fear has taken humanity thousands of years. The journey is still continuing. Every discovery builds upon those that came before. Even the mistakes of history contributed to the search for better answers. The physicians who believed in bloodletting were wrong, but they wanted to heal. The monks who prayed beside frightened patients were limited by the knowledge of their age, but many offered genuine comfort. The families who searched desperately for cures did so because they loved the people who were suffering. History deserves honesty. It also deserves compassion. Looking back at the Middle Ages is not an opportunity to laugh at those who came before us. It is an opportunity to appreciate how difficult it is to understand illnesses that cannot be seen. The horrifying truth about medieval anxiety treatments is not simply that they involve blood, pain, or terrifying rituals. The real horror was living in a world where invisible suffering had almost no accurate explanation. And perhaps the greatest triumph of modern medicine is not merely the development of better treatments. It is the recognition that people experiencing anxiety deserve dignity, respect, scientific care, and hope. That may be the most important lesson the Middle Ages still have to teach us.